No one ever imagined that in the West there existed a place where a man could sell his daughter the way one might sell a lame horse, and that someone would be willing to buy. In a forgotten frontier town, so faded it barely clung to the map, strange markets were once held, not for horses, not for guns, but for daughters. No one remembers the girl's name that day, only that her belly was swollen, the hem of her dress was frayed, and her mother held her hand like she was dragging out a cheap item to auction off. Whistler Hollow at night felt like an open wound that hadn't dried, lying silent in a valley covered in the ash of old things. Tin-roofed houses slumped toward the earth as if trying to hide something that had long since died. The night wind didn't whisper, it shredded. It sliced through the cracks in old boards, lifted dark dust into the air and laid it gently over coats, leather hats, and worn-down boots. At the end of an alley behind an old warehouse, beyond the reach of any light, a pile of straw smoldered in a slow-burning fire. Nearby, coarse laughter mingled with the stink of cheap tobacco and harsh liquor. A pack of men, mostly miners, horse traders, and those surviving on the dying breath of the West, squatted around the fire, shaking tin cups, glancing sideways at the woman standing just outside the glow. June stood there, 8 months pregnant under a thin, faded dress, her eyes unfocused, looking past everyone. She stared into the distance, toward the collapsed fence at the edge of the dirt lot, where there was nothing but darkness. Her brown hair was messily tied behind her neck, and the bruise on her left cheek had turned a sickly yellow. One wrist hung loosely bound by a rope, not to restrain but to hold, held the way one holds a half-broke horse, or a mule too tired to pull. The woman next to her, her mother, if one could still call her that, was speaking to a man with a thick mustache and teeth like crooked fence posts. She wore an old cloak stained with dry mud up to the knees, and the sour stench of vinegar rose every time she bent down to spit. Her voice was dry and scratchy, like sunburnt bark. "Ain't nobody wants her now, but you boys know, this one, she used to fetch a price." There was loud laughter, a snort, and the clink of coins in someone's pocket. No one asked June her name. No one asked who the baby belonged to. They only asked, "How far along?" Then, "Can she still walk?" And her mother answered with curt nods, and by patting her daughter's belly like she was hawking a pregnant mule. A gust of wind rolled through. The fire coughed up gray smoke. June shivered, not from the cold, but from the silence. A strange kind of silence circled her amid all the noise. In her mind, a sound cut through, the creak of the old door swinging open behind her one last time before she left home. The woman's voice, "Open your mouth again, I'll cut it open." She didn't speak again. Then the man appeared. No one saw him arrive. He was just there, standing at the edge of the marketplace where the shadows thickened. Tall, broad-shouldered, with worn leather gloves, a trimmed beard peppered black and silver, and eyes that looked at no one. His eyes were on the ground, at his boots maybe, or farther out, where footsteps had once been but were now buried under the dust of time. Silas Ward. No one spoke his name. No one dared ask anything when he stepped forward. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't look at June. He simply stopped before the woman, pulled a small cloth pouch from his coat, and tossed it onto the dirt. The sound of old silver clinking, low and heavy. Along with it, a bottle of plum whiskey wrapped in burlap, and a quarter-folded piece of paper. A note pledging half a butchered calf to be delivered come fall. The woman bent down to pick it up. She didn't count, just nodded, then unlooped the rope from June's wrist, like she was untying a bundle of freight. "Go on," she muttered, not looking at her daughter. "This one's paying more than you're worth." Silas didn't touch June. He merely tilted his head toward the horse tied beneath the cypress, a large, dark-coated animal with an old saddle and tired eyes. as if it had run through winter without ever finding a destination. June stepped forward, hand on her belly. She didn't cry, just swallowed dry and climbed onto the horse without needing help. The market returned to its raucous clamor. Laughter, mugs clinking. Someone whistled. Someone called out, "Careful, she don't bite, Ward." But Silas said nothing. He mounted behind her, didn't lift a whip, only gave a small signal. The two rode off without a backward glance. Behind them, the straw fire burned low, laughter dissolving into the night fog. Ahead, the dirt road into the woods was half frozen. The wind blew into their faces, and dust from old seasons rose to meet them, veiling the sky behind. The old horse walked steadily over the cracks of frozen earth, hooves pressing down on a thin crust of ice that coated the dirt road. Wind from the cedar ridge blew sideways, sharp and bitter like a dull blade slicing through worn wool. On the back saddle, June sat leaning slightly, both hands cradling her heavy belly, her eyes fixed on the man's back in front of her, as if staring at a wall she could never climb, never pierce through. No one spoke, and there was no need. They rode as if both had long since grown accustomed to silence, not the kind that soothes, but the kind that sharpens every thought in the mind until it rings clear and cold. June didn't know who Silas was, didn't know where he lived or why he had bought her. All she knew was that when he got on the horse, his hands didn't shake, his eyes didn't flinch, and his footsteps didn't look back. Her lower back ached, her spine throbbed. The jostling of the saddle made her wince, but she didn't make a sound. She was used to no one caring when she hurt. The cold seeped up from her boots into her heels, crawled along her bones, but she said nothing. Whether it was the wind that bit harder or the soul of the man beside her that was colder, she couldn't say. Snowdust began to fall, thin, weightless. A few flakes landed on her lashes, melting instantly, like tears that never got the chance to fall. Silas wore no hat. He simply pulled up the collar of his leather coat. His posture wasn't slouched, wasn't overly rigid, but there was something in the way he sat the saddle that made it clear. This was a man who had traveled far for a long time and lost many things he no longer spoke of. The road up the mountain curled and twisted, hovering between the trees. Now and then came the tapping of a woodpecker or the scurry of a mouse beneath rotting leaves. Occasionally Silas would lift a hand to point, not a word, just a signal. Avoid the stone, step over the root. Gestures not demanded, but just enough to keep her from falling. June didn't know where he was taking her, and strangely, she wasn't afraid, just tired. Her back throbbed. Her right hand clutched a small knife still tucked in her boot, the last oath she still held from the past. By the time they arrived, the sky had turned a pale ashen gray. The cabin leaned into the mountain slope, surrounded by sparse trees. No fence, no smoke from the chimney. The door sat slightly ajar. The wooden shingles on the roof had been faded by rain and wind, like the skin of an old man who'd lived too long past his grief. Silas dismounted without a word. He opened the side shed, tied up the reins, then gave a small nod toward the front steps. June dismounted slowly, one hand on her belly, the other trailing along the wood siding like a blind person stepping into an unfamiliar light. She stepped inside. No smell of tobacco, no smell of a man, only pine, cold ashes, and a faint hint of dried lemon. A cleanliness so pure it made one uneasy. The house was as quiet as an abandoned church. On the fireplace mantel sat a single tilted photo frame. No man in the picture. Only a young woman, her hair tied behind her neck, holding a blanket wrapped around something unseen. Her eyes were bright, not smiling, not sorrowful, just bright. June stood there, unsure whether to remove her coat or let the cold soak into her chest. Behind her, Silas placed a log in the hearth and lit the fire without looking at her. Then he pointed to the room on the left. He didn't say, "Here's your room." Didn't say, "You'll sleep here." Just nodded, then stepped out the back door, leaving her alone in a space where no voice lived, only the creak of old wood, like memories that hadn't been touched in years. The door closed behind her, and June stood still. The room was small, its walls made of plain wood with no lock. Wind slipped through the narrow window crack, gently stirring the clay-colored curtain. Light from the oil lamp in the main room spilled through a split in the wood, casting a long streak across the wall, like the trace of a hand left behind by someone who had lived here before her. There was no iron bed, just a solid wooden frame covered with a thick ash-brown blanket, neatly folded. Beside it, a low wooden table held a basin of warm water, still faintly steaming, a bar of soap broken in half, a toothbrush with bristles already fanned at the tip, and a clean washcloth folded into quarters, laid out like quiet offerings at a silent altar. On the windowsill sat a glass cup holding a sprig of rosemary, long since dried. June stepped closer, resting a hand on the edge of the bed. Her belly strained forward, heavier now after the long ride. Beneath her feet, the old hide rug no longer carried a scent, but its soft give underfoot suggested a family had once lived here, or at least had tried to. She sat down, not daring to lean back. Out in the hearth, firelight flickered, illuminating the photo she had seen upon entering. The young woman with the white blanket. No expensive wooden frame, no flowers, just a photo propped at an angle, as if someone had once meant to place it upright, then thought better of it. June looked around and noticed something. A handkerchief, embroidered with pale blue thread, neatly folded and resting on the mantel. The design was nothing more than a series of tiny circular dots, not flowers, not initials, just repeating spirals, like the footprints of a child learning to walk in someone's memory. A gust of wind passed through, rustling the handkerchief, then snuffed out the glow of the oil lamp. Darkness returned to the room, gentle but biting. June stood and opened the small bundle her mother had shoved into her hands. Inside, only an old dress and the small knife wrapped in rough cloth. She hid the knife beneath the pillow, then removed her outer dress and wiped her face with the clean towel, soaking it in warm water, moving slowly, as if relearning how to be human. Her hand stopped when she saw her reflection in the water glass beside the table. The face looking back was hardly recognizable. Sunken eyes, dry lips, but something strange lingered, something unfamiliar. In that watery mirror, June did not see fear. Instead, it felt as if she stood before an abandoned house, and perhaps someone had lit a lamp for her there long ago. She lay down, turning onto her side, toward her belly. The child stirred gently like a whisper that couldn't find words. Outside, the fire crackled steadily. No door was locked. No footsteps paced outside, and for that very reason, she couldn't sleep. Night in the mountains often came slowly, but once it settled, it did not retreat easily. The night wind scratched gently at the roof, not fierce, just persistent, like a wandering soul knocking over and over on memories that had never quite closed. June lay on the bed, eyes wide open, hand resting on her belly, now full and round like a moon among trees, ears attuned to the faintest sound beyond the room. The sound of a needle piercing fabric, the soft swish of thread sliding through. Not the sound of sneaking footsteps, not arguments or shouting or drunken rants, just sewing, steady, patient, quiet, the way someone sews when they've lived too long in a house too empty. She sat up. Her feet moved softly, boots unlaced to avoid making noise. Part of her wanted to know what was happening. Another part simply could no longer bear the tightness of curiosity pressing against her chest. The door wasn't locked, only pulled nearly shut. June nudged it open just enough for the glow of the hearth to reach her eyes, and in that narrow stretch of light, she saw him. Silas Ward. The man sat beside a low table, his back hunched slightly forward, the wooden chair creaking softly under the silent weight of him. In his hands was a piece of milk-white cloth, no bigger than a baby's bib. He held a needle threading pale blue string, each stitch curving in a simple spiral. Not flowers, not letters, just a swirl like a stream circling a stone. The oil lamp on the table cast a soft sidelight on his face. Eyes squinting slightly, beard flecked with silver. Not a word. No excess expression. Yet there was something in the way he sat that made time feel suspended, as if he'd been sitting there since the very night the cabin was first raised, and would still be there long after everyone else had gone. June stood in the shadows, not daring to step farther. Her hand was still on the knife hilt tucked in her boot, but her fingers had stopped gripping it. For the first time, she didn't know whether to fear this man or pity him. He sewed as if speaking to someone only he could hear, perhaps a child he had once lost, perhaps the woman in the tilted photograph on the hearth, or maybe just a long-ago version of himself, from a time when belief hadn't yet rotted away under the weight of winter. Then came a soft pop. The thread snapped. Silas paused. His thumb had been pricked, a tiny dot of blood, just enough to make him exhale slowly, not from pain but from habit, as though wounds no longer surprised him. June backed away and closed the door, quietly, as softly as the very handkerchief he was stitching. She returned to bed, removed her boots, slid the knife back inside her clothing. But unlike the night before, she didn't hide it as a weapon, just as an old habit not yet broken. Lying down, she pulled the blanket up to her chest and stared at the ceiling. Her eyes closed, for the first time in many months, not from exhaustion but because something in this house, the light, the sound of thread, the smell of dry wood, made her think that maybe not everyone who is silent is hiding something. The next morning the snow had stopped. Early sunlight crept shyly through the cedar ridge, glinting across the frozen ground, making the entire forest look like an oil painting brushed with powdered silver. The air was thin, cold, and still, the kind of day that didn't seem to have anything planned. June woke early, as always. She warmed water to wash her face, quietly folded the towel, and smoothed out the blanket as if afraid someone might come inspect the room, even though she knew no one would. Her fingers brushed the window frame as she listened to the clucking of hens outside the coop. Not noisy, just the sound of something still alive. Below the steps, Silas was splitting wood. Each axe stroke was sure and even, never wasteful. June watched through the window, and for reasons she couldn't explain, the sight of him doing something so dull, so heavy, brought more comfort than any kind word ever could. By noon, the sound of hooves stopped in front of the house. An old wagon with a canvas top dusted in red clay. Down stepped Mrs. Caldera, a cold country woman, hair silver like cinders, lips always seeming to tuck away half a bitter smile. She didn't knock. She walked in as if the place were her own kitchen. In her hand was a brown cloth sack. Inside, hard bread, a ceramic jug of milk, and a half-empty jar of peach preserves. Silas said nothing. He only stepped back to let her place the bag on the wooden table. Then her gaze drifted toward June. Not probing, not gentle. Just a look, the kind given by someone who'd seen too many stories and now only wanted to be sure. What they were looking at was real. June, for reasons she didn't understand, suddenly wanted to cover her belly. But she didn't. She lifted her chin, met Mrs. Caldera's gaze directly, as if to say, "I know what you're about to say, but I'm still here." Mrs. Caldera raised an eyebrow, then exhaled. They say his wife died in that bed, and he just sat there. Didn't lift a hand. Just watched until she stopped breathing. Her voice held no malice, nor pity. It was like talking about a harvest. Cold, slow, and leaving just enough space for others to fill in their own guesses. June didn't answer, neither did Silas. But the silence that followed wasn't a wall, it was a drifting fog, thick enough to blur everything, to make you unsure what was truth and what was rumor. Mrs. Caldera stepped toward the door. Before leaving, she turned and set the milk jug on the shelf. She didn't say, "For the young girl." She didn't say, "For the baby in her belly." She just left it. No note, no name. Then climbed back into the wagon and was gone. That afternoon, the wind changed direction. June stayed in the kitchen, wiping down the wooden table, rearranging a few old items. Her hand brushed the jug of milk, cold, the ceramic course like the hearts of people from town. She didn't drink it, but she didn't throw it out either. That night she lay again on the bed, eyes on the ceiling. Mrs. Caldera's story circled her thoughts, like the handkerchief Silas had sewn the night before, each stitch left unfinished. If it was true, if he really had just sat there as the woman died, then why? Was it fear? Was it despair? Or had he simply learned that sometimes people cannot stop what's already coming? Wind tapped lightly at the window. A cedar branch fell on the roof with a clatter, like the footsteps of someone returning late. June closed her eyes, her hand rested on her belly. No one in that house spoke a single word all evening, but everything had changed. 3 days later, it rained. Not the fierce kind of rain from the lowlands, but a slow rain, falling drop by drop, steady, cold, and lingering like a memory that refuses to fade. June stood under the eaves, arms wrapped around a bucket of clean water, eyes shifting between the sky above and her mud-splattered boots below. She had learned a few things around the house by now: how to light the stove, collect rainwater, clean the chicken coop. No one told her she had to, but no one told her not to either. Silas remained the same, splitting wood every morning, feeding the horse every evening and by night, either sewing handkerchiefs or mending sagging boards in the wall. He lived like someone so used to loneliness, he'd forgotten it ever had another name besides companion. But it was that very silence that made June feel small. Each passing day, she felt like a shadow adrift in the woods, fed, kept warm, yet no one asked where she was going, and no one asked what she wanted. One afternoon, while Silas had gone to town to buy salt, June took the chance to wash laundry out back. While hanging up the clothes, she found a few old coins tucked inside the pocket of a man's trousers, draped over the line. Not much, but enough to buy a meal if she ever made it to the first rest stop beyond the mountain ridge. She looked around. No one. June took the coins and hid them inside the lining of her inner shirt. Then she went back inside, opened the wooden chest by the wall. From it she took the small knife her mother had given her that first day, wrapping it carefully in a scrap of rough cloth. This time she didn't hide it in her boot. She slid it behind her back into the padding beneath her coat. That night she sat by the window watching the thin moonlight weave through the clouds. There was no clear plan. She only knew this: if she stayed longer, she would be swallowed into these wooden walls, into those wordless glances, into nameless kindness and the quiet seams of stitched cloth. She remembered something her mother once said, laughing: "If a man doesn't hit you, that's already good. But if he starts sewing handkerchiefs for you, run. The quiet ones are always the dangerous ones." June no longer believed her mother, but she couldn't unremember everything. She clenched the embroidered handkerchief she had stolen from Silas's table, the only thing in the house that felt gentle. A few days later, the season turned again. Heavy clouds, wind rushed through the window cracks. June knew if she meant to leave, it had to be soon, before the snow blanketed every path, before the child inside her grew heavier than her own footsteps. But what she hadn't expected was that the wind that year felt different from the others. It carried the damp scent of the forest, of rotting mushrooms and something else. something like the smell of old cloth just turned over. The wind also brought a feeling, as if someone was watching her, quietly, the same way Silas watched the world. June still made her plans, still hid the money, still kept the knife, but inside her a doubt began to take root, not about Silas but about herself. What did she fear more? The man who never spoke, or the fact that she was starting to believe in something she had no right to believe in? The cabin door was ajar. June stood frozen in the early mist, where silver moonlight smeared like ash through the breaks in the forest. Her hand clutched the wooden-handled knife, hidden beneath the folds of her wool sweater. Wind swept through the pines and into her collar like a warning, go or stay and drown, like every winter before. She turned her head, looking once more at the door. Inside, Silas was still asleep, or just pretending not to know. A single snowflake landed on the back of her hand. Then a second, light as a warning whispered from the sky. June stepped down off the porch. The night forest breathed in scattered sounds. A screech owl calling from somewhere distant, a dry twig snapping under a deer's step, and her own heartbeat pounding like it might crack her ribs. The scent of rotting mushrooms, wet leaves, and thick pine resin turned in her stomach. She inhaled slowly, holding her belly. The child inside kicked gently, as if it too felt the mother's fear. "Not like last time," she whispered into the hem of her skirt. "This time, Mama won't let them take me back." Last time, when she ran from the camp, when her mother had grabbed her hair and dragged her through the dust, clawing at her face with rings that reeked of cheap liquor, that memory still lived in June like splinters under skin. She bit her lip and pressed on, following the moss-slick trail, hoofbeats, distant but real, a group of riders, voices bleeding through the wind like echoes from the bottom of a well. Anyone seen the knocked-up girl? Heard she ran off with the old man's stash. Whistler Hollow didn't need proof, only accusation. If they found her, no one would ask for the truth. June veered off the trail, plunging into a thicket of low brush. Thorns tore her hands, blood soaking through her sleeve. Her belly cramped, her back seized like something twisting it in half. But she didn't stop. Then, silence. A sound so faint you had to hold your breath to hear it. A soft scraping, like claws gently raking bark. June froze. She raised her head, eyes locked on the shifting shape ahead. A gray wolf, thin, yellow-eyed, nose cutting the air like a blade. It had caught the scent of blood. June stepped back, on her toes. Her grip on the knife trembled like a drawn bowstring. She knew she couldn't fight, but she wouldn't kneel either. From her coat pocket something slipped and struck a rock. A metallic clink, sharp and hollow, clack, clack. The wind chime made of bullet casings, something she'd tucked away without thinking, packing in haste, carrying a piece of the home she was trying to leave behind. The wolf flinched. The wind shifted, the hoofbeats faded, the animal vanished like smoke. June collapsed. Her hands clutched her belly, her cheek pressed to the frozen ground. Snow began to fall. She didn't know how long she lay there. Her eyes wouldn't open. Her lips were cracked. She thought of the baby, not as a burden, but as the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. "Don't cry," she whispered, like an old lullaby. "Mama's not dead. Mama's just resting a while." Wind howled through the trees. Somewhere, the wind chime of bullet shells rang again. Lost among snow and branches, another wave of pain came. Stronger, it folded her in half, arms wrapping her stomach as if cradling a world that was crumbling. The wind rose again, but this time it came with hoofbeats. Through the blur of snow, a figure appeared, wearing a dark leather coat, hood pulled deep, eyes that seemed to see through even the storm. Silas Ward. He didn't ask why, didn't scold, He simply dismounted, knelt beside her, slid his arms under her back, not roughly, not hurriedly, as if he had carried someone in pain many times before, as if his body had learned how not to cause more hurt. June, half conscious, heard him murmur, his voice low as earth. "Wind's off. It don't follow the usual path. I knew something was wrong." And then she passed out, into the scent of wood smoke and leather still clinging to his coat. Everything dissolved into white. Silas lifted her onto the horse, holding her close. The horse turned, retracing the same prints she had left behind. Step by step, loop by loop, as if the escape had never happened at all. The cabin warmed, not from the fire, but from the quiet weight of worry that blanketed everything. Silas laid June down on a straw-stuffed mat spread over the floor. The room was lit only by a small oil lamp, its glow casting the two of them as silent shadows on the wooden walls. Tilted, blurred and thinner than life, the wind still howled at the window. Snow gathered in the seams of the cabin walls, scraping softly like the breath of a starving animal. June whimpered, her hand clutching his shirt, not out of trust, but instinct. The knife hidden in her coat had been lost somewhere along the way. Now only the pounding of her heart and the deep, tearing pain across her lower belly remained, crashing through her like waves against stone. Silas said nothing. He removed his coat, folding it beneath her back. Then he soaked a cloth in warm water and placed it on her forehead. His hands weren't clean, weren't soft, but they were steady, no trembling, no hesitation, just the hands of a man who had stood beside death too many times, and now was trying to hold someone back from its reach. In that small room, time no longer moved. There was only the wind, the creaking of wood shrinking in the cold, and the waves of pain coming like church bells, beginning, peaking, fading, then beginning again. June didn't scream. She didn't cry. She bit her lip, eyes locked on the ceiling as if letting go for even a second would send the child slipping away with everything else. Cold sweat gathered at her neck, soaking into her hair like rain seeping into an open wound. Silas sat beside her, never daring to touch her belly, only reaching for her hand each time a contraction peaked. He didn't know any prayers, didn't believe in God, but in that moment he counted the beat of her pulse, one by one, as if, should he stop, something might be lost forever. Outside, the snow kept falling. No one knew, no one came. Only two people and a life trying to find its way into the coldest place in the world. Then, in the silence between all sounds, a cry rang out, not loud, not sharp, but clear, like the first crack in spring ice. June's head dropped, her eyes wide open. She didn't cry. She only breathed, long, heavy, as if not quite believing she still could. Silas cut the cord with a knife heated red in the flames, wiped the child clean with the very handkerchief he'd left unfinished days ago, then wrapped it and placed the bundle into June's arms. The child was a girl, eyes shut tight, lips pressed together as if not ready to speak to the world. But she was alive. She had arrived. No doctor, no clinic, no words of congratulations, just human warmth and a fire that had not yet gone out. Silas sat down, leaning slightly, looking at the two of them as if standing before something too vast to name. Not happiness, not a miracle, just a moment that both he and June understood. They were no longer strangers beneath the same roof. In the straw-lit glow, June reached out, touched her daughter's cheek, and whispered something the wind carried away. The wind stopped by morning. Snow had piled nearly half a foot deep outside the cabin. The windows were fogged with breath. Wood creaked softly with the shift of cold. Everything was white, white like the first page of a life newly begun. Silas sat in the old wooden chair, leaning slightly, his hand still holding needle and thread out of habit, though he was no longer stitching anything. June lay on the straw bedding, her head resting on a bundle of soft blankets. Her daughter slept curled on her chest, skin to skin, breath as thin as mist. No one spoke. The silence was no longer tense. It had been forged through pain, through blood, through fear faced alone, and through that single moment when a child first let out her cry. June opened her eyes, stared at the dimming fire, then glanced at Silas. She no longer looked at him as a stranger, not quite family either, but as someone who had crossed a threshold without ever knocking. After a long while, in a whisper so faint it was like telling it only to herself, June spoke. "My mother wanted to take me into the gold camps, said the miners would pay more for something fresh and unopened. So she sold me off first, said I'd be easier to train that way." She didn't cry, didn't curse. The words fell like a hammer striking wood already cracked. It didn't shatter, it simply echoed. Silas still didn't look up, but his hand paused as though the thread in his fingers had snagged midway through a seam. After a moment he placed the spool gently on the table. "I had 3 children once. None of them made it through their first winter. My wife couldn't take the last one. She looked at me and said, 'That's enough.' Next morning I found her. She'd tied the rope herself up in the loft. The room didn't change color. No cry broke the stillness, only the sound of the fire, soft pops and cracks like slow-burning drops of time. June stroked her daughter's cheek, her eyes fixed on those rough, calloused hands, the hands of a man who had lost the right to be called father 3 times, and now sat beside a child that bore no blood of his. Silas lowered his head, speaking as if to the fire itself. "I didn't cry then. Don't even know if I remember how to now, but I remember how to keep a fire going. I remember how to keep something alive through a cold night." June didn't reply. She only pulled the child tighter to her chest. The little girl stirred, her tiny hand grasping a strand of her mother's hair, lips pressing together as if ready to say something, but didn't. There was nothing more that needed saying. Everything had been made clear. Though clarity didn't make it any lighter, it was still heavy. But the kind of weight that paves a road, not a chain that drags. Outside the window, the sun began breaking through the cloud cover. The first ray skimmed across the snow, then touched the corner of June's eye, shimmering as if someone had just wiped away an old dream. 4 days after the snowstorm. The snow hadn't fully melted, but it had softened. The first slanting sunlight of late winter streamed through the cedar branches, tinting the moss on the cabin roof the color of dried honey. June sat near the window in the old rocking chair that had long gone unused. The baby girl lay snug in a wooden cradle, one Silas had spent the last few days quietly repairing. The cradle's 4 legs tilted slightly on the uneven floor, but it gave the motion a gentle rhythm, swaying like the breath of someone sleeping peacefully. On the table, beside a cold pot of tea, Silas folded the last of the small cloths. He had sewn 8 pairs of wool socks, 2 little hats, and 3 fabric diapers. No one had asked him to. No one was counting, but June saw and kept everything to herself, the way one keeps warmth in by not opening the door. That afternoon, when sunlight finally reached the tiny soles of the baby's feet in the cradle, June spoke. "I want to name her Ada." Silas looked over, not asking why, but for the first time in days his eyes met June's directly, not glancing past, not averting. June didn't explain. Her voice was steady, soft, as if the name had lived inside her for a long time. Not after anyone, not from scripture, just soft enough to survive, strong enough to take root. Silas lowered his head. He didn't nod, but he didn't disagree. He stepped outside, then returned with a piece of dry pine wood. Sitting down, he began to carve the name ADA into the surface, letter by letter, no extra strokes, no wasted cuts. That night they placed the small nameplate at the head of the cradle. The name stood there like a young sapling emerging after a snowstorm. Not tall, not strong yet, but real. In that moment, June looked at the baby sleeping, then toward Silas, who had nodded off beside the stove, his coat steeped in the scent of cold smoke and sawdust. She didn't know if he had once believed that light was something to fear, as he'd once said. But that night, in the flicker of firelight and the steady breathing of a newborn, June understood. Perhaps, like her, he too was learning how not to bow his head when light began to pour in. March knocked with damp winds from the south. The snow slowly receded, revealing wet earth and roots reaching from the ground like old hands. Moss on the cabin roof began to green again. In the forest, birds cautiously opened their throats after long months of silence. Ada was 3 weeks old. She slept well, nursed strong, cried little. June, a mother for the first time, was learning to interpret every whimper, every curled fist, every shifting motion under the blanket, as if it were a secret language spoken only between the two of them. Silas still rose before dawn, boiled water, stoked the fire, repaired the fence. He never intruded when June cared for the child. He simply left a crate of dry wood by the door or set a bowl of warm soup nearby, then withdrew like a bird passing behind a wall. Everything seemed steady, but it was exactly then that fear began to knock. June started feeling aches in her back, headaches, and then missed her bleeding. The fear didn't come all at once. It crept in like morning fog, damp, cold, and lingering. One night she sat beside Ada's cradle, hands idle, eyes unblinking. Silas was mending a chair just a few steps away. Neither said a word. Then June spoke, her voice barely more than breath. "If I'm pregnant again, I'm afraid I'll turn into my mother, a woman who only knew how to bear children and sell them off, one way or another." The words fell into the room like the sound of wood cracking, not loud, but enough to make everything pause. Silas set his needle down. He didn't turn toward her, didn't move closer. He just said, voice rough, "I don't know how to be a father, but I know how to keep a fire burning till morning, every day." June turned her head, looked at him through the firelight. It wasn't a promise, it wasn't a vow, it was just the truth, plain, unadorned, like the way he lived. She lowered her head and exhaled. Maybe she would still be afraid, but at least now, that fear had a name, and someone had heard it and hadn't walked away. On an early morning at the end of March, the snow had completely melted from the trail. Silas opened the door and stepped onto the porch, just as he did every day, ready to grab his axe and split wood. But at the bottom step, he stopped. A woven basket sat quietly beside the rotting porch post. No one had knocked. No one had called his name. There was only the basket, clean, square, and tied with a simple rope, like the kind used to bind goods carried home from the market. Inside, a jar of preserved peaches, a square of white hand-embroidered cloth, the stitches even, the pattern old-fashioned, in one line of words stitched in brown thread. "Pretty, keep it safe." No signature, no explanation. Silas sat down on the porch steps, his fingers brushing the edge of the fabric. The rising sun angled through the thinning woods, lighting up the words, "Keep it safe," like a quiet order. From no one, or perhaps from whatever we leave behind. June saw it from inside the house. She didn't ask, who left it? She didn't need to. She knew. Maybe it was the neighbor woman from the other day. Maybe it was someone from town, one of the women who'd once looked at her belly with blank eyes. Maybe it was a stranger who'd only heard the story and wanted to leave behind something, just once, before walking away. But they hadn't knocked. They left only footprints in the wet earth, then disappeared into the woods, like wind. June brought the basket inside, set the jar of peaches on the table, laid the cloth across the side of Ada's cradle, then sat down without a word. What she felt wasn't exactly forgiveness, nor was it anger. It was a quietness, sharp and cold, like a root pushing deeper into thawed earth. The world doesn't soften easily, but now she knew. It could begin with a square of stitched fabric, a jar of peaches, a silence that no longer bore the shape of a blade. And that was enough for one day. Spring arrived like a stranger who didn't knock, leaving only streaks of sunlight on the wooden windowsill and the scent of fresh earth in the patch of grass behind the house. Ada had learned to crawl, then to stand, then fall, and then to stand again. One morning, June let her sit in the dirt yard out front. In Ada's hand was a small wooden spoon, her very first toy, once used by Silas to stir porridge, now worn smooth like a keepsake, passed down through 3 long winters. Silas stood beneath the old cedar tree, hand resting on his axe, eyes fixed on the child. He didn't speak, he only watched, like a man guarding something so precious he dared not touch it. Ada took a step. The spoon dropped. The first time, she fell. June didn't move. Neither did Silas. Both just watched. Ada dropped her head to the ground, then pushed herself back up. The second time, she rose, trembling like a reed in strong wind. The third time, she took 2 steps, then fell again. But this time she laughed. A coarse, uneven laugh. Not perfect, not round, but it rang like wind chimes striking in a yard that hadn't heard anything joyful in far too long. June bent down and lifted Ada into her arms. The baby nestled her head into her mother's shoulder, tiny fist still gripping the spoon like she'd just conquered some distant land. June turned and called out, She called you Pa." Silas didn't speak right away. He looked down at the earth, at the shadow stretched long across the sunlit ground, then back at Ada. The child with no shared blood, no shared name, but the one thing that had made this land feel no longer silent. At last, he spoke. Slowly. "I don't think I'm her father, but I think—" He sat down beside the old tree, calloused hand gripping the axe handle, like it was the only thing tethering him to the moment. "I think I'm the soil she chose to grow from." Then he smiled, not a polite smile, not for a joke, not to reassure anyone, but a real smile, the kind worn by a man who once believed his life had gone still the day his wife died in the attic. June didn't answer, but she saw it. That smile didn't ring out, didn't linger long, but it was thick, deep and warm enough to carry them into the summer ahead. Early morning, a thin mist veiled the hill behind the house. Tender grass pushed up between the stones, glowing with a pale green sheen in the first light of summer. The wind came from the valley, carrying the scent of damp earth, cooled hearth smoke, and the faint sweetness of cornbread from the old stove on the porch. June stood at the threshold, one hand resting gently on her belly. The rough fabric of her dress puffed slightly in the morning breeze. No one spoke of the second child. No one counted the days. But she knew. In the way women who've given birth always know. No test needed. Only that quiet certainty, like light slipping through ribs on a silent morning. Down in the yard, Ada played with a few newly hatched chicks. They scattered around her, dodging her little hands like dry leaves skipping from the wind. Silas sat in the old chair, whittling a scrap of wood, not for anything, just to keep his hands busy when the heart wanted stillness. Ada looked up, called something out, then tumbled into a pile of straw. Neither adult moved, as if they already believed the girl would stand again, like a weed pushing through stone. June watched Ada, then looked farther, past the cedars, past the sloped roof, toward the trail where she had once been led like a thing for sale. The wind swept through her hair, brushing a strand from her cheek. She closed her eyes and then said, not loudly, not quite to anyone, but as if speaking to herself, Not everything that dies needs to be buried. Some things should be left to bloom. A small bird landed on the fence and chirped twice, rough, cracking notes like its voice was still finding itself after a long winter. Ada stood up again, a fistful of straw in hand, running toward her mother. Silas watched her and gave a small nod. The sun slanted across the porch, illuminating the dust in the air like snow that hadn't quite melted, but no longer cold. In the field below the hill, wildflowers had begun to bloom. No one had planted them, no one tended them. They only needed time. Some Western stories aren't meant to be retold. They're meant to be carried quietly, like a scrap of cloth kept in a coat pocket, to be taken out when needed, remembered, looked at, breathed through. The girl who was once sold like an object, the man who thought his life had died with the past, and the child, born of no legacy, no name, but proof that beauty still grows from stone. This isn't a story of miracles, no gunfire, no noble deaths, just a house quiet enough to rest in, a hand that knows how to tend a flame, and a heart learning how to stand up again after long winters. If you've ever known someone like Silas, if you've ever been someone like June, or if you believe that even what has cracked can still bloom, leave us a line. It doesn't have to be long, only true. We'll read it, as if we're listening to you beside the firelight. The West isn't just guns and horses. It's where people learn to survive through kindness.